I need you to leave before they arrive.
You already packed my bag.
We need the property owner upstairs. Why are you looking at him? The records are certified.
Certified to whom?
Jeffrey Lewis was 42, the quiet maintenance supervisor everyone recognized at Harbor Point residences in downtown Seattle. Most residents believed he was simply an aging blue-collar worker whose successful wife had outgrown him. He drove an old Ford F-150, carried homemade lunches in a scratched metal box, and never wore anything more expensive than faded work boots. What they didn't know was that Harbor Point and every luxury apartment inside it belonged to him. Then, Nora quietly placed his overnight bag beside the front door and asked him to leave before her guests arrived. Jeffrey rested his wedding band on the kitchen counter, reached for the doorknob, and heard the elevator doors open outside. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories where patience, truth, and justice matter more than revenge, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss tomorrow's story. The first time Jeffrey Lewis met Nora Collins, she was sitting alone in a corner booth inside a small coffee shop near the University of Washington. Rain rolled down the windows in slow streams, turning the lights outside into blurred ribbons of gold. She had 3 real estate textbooks spread across the table, a laptop balanced on a stack of legal pads, and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Jeffrey noticed one thing before he noticed her face. She kept erasing the same line in her notebook. She looked determined but exhausted. He ordered black coffee, nodded politely as he passed her table, and sat several booths away. Neither of them spoke. 2 hours later, the cafe announced it was closing. Nora reached into her purse, paused, and quietly counted the bills in her wallet. She frowned. She had forgotten that tuition had emptied her checking account that week. Without drawing attention to himself, Jeffrey paid both receipts while collecting his own. When the cashier mentioned it, Nora hurried after him into the rain. "Excuse me," she called. Jeffrey turned. "You paid for my coffee. It wasn't much. I still owe you." He smiled faintly. "Then buy coffee for someone else someday." He walked away before she could ask his name. That simple conversation should have ended there. Instead, 3 weeks later, they met again inside the downtown Seattle Public Library. This time, she recognized him first. "You still won't let me repay you?" Jeffrey laughed quietly. "I guess we keep choosing the same places." From that afternoon forward, their lives slowly began moving in the same direction. The narrator could see something Jeffrey himself never tried to explain. He admired people who built something through effort. Nora was one of those people. She waited tables 4 evenings each week while studying commercial real estate finance. She rarely complained, even when working double shifts before morning classes. Jeffrey respected discipline, not ambition. Discipline. There was a difference. Within a year, they were dating. Within 3 years, they were married. Most of their friends believed Jeffrey worked in building operations because he enjoyed practical work. That part was true. What nobody asked was why someone with his education seemed completely uninterested in climbing the corporate ladder. Jeffrey had graduated near the top of his business program years earlier. He understood finance, corporate law, property management, commercial development. Yet every weekday morning he put on work boots instead of tailored suits. Nora occasionally teased him about it. "You'd look handsome in a corner office." "I'd rather know whether the elevators actually work." She laughed every time. Back then she believed he was joking. He wasn't. During their first years of marriage, they rented a modest apartment in Fremont. Their furniture came from estate sales. Their dining table had scratches across one corner. Their television was nearly 10 years old. Whenever something broke, Jeffrey repaired it instead of replacing it. Not because he couldn't afford another one, because he disliked waste. Every Friday evening he cooked dinner himself, usually grilled salmon, sometimes homemade chili, sometimes nothing more complicated than burgers on the balcony overlooking the neighborhood. Those evenings became their tradition. Nora often spoke about the future. "I want clients who own skyscrapers someday." "You will." "I want to sell buildings people recognize." "You probably will." "I don't want an ordinary life." Jeffrey looked across the table. "There isn't anything ordinary about building a good one." She smiled then. She believed they meant the same thing. Years later, she would realize they never had. As Nora's career expanded, so did her circle of acquaintances. Her first promotion came at Emerald Pacific Realty. Then another. Within 6 years, she was representing luxury condominiums overlooking Elliott Bay. Her wardrobe changed first. Tailored jackets, Italian shoes, designer handbags. Then came invitations, private networking dinners, wine tastings, fundraisers inside luxury hotels, investment seminars attended by developers whose projects appeared across Seattle's skyline. Jeffrey attended several events during the early years. He stood quietly beside Nora. He listened far more than he spoke. When someone asked what he did for a living, he always answered honestly. "I work maintenance." People smiled politely before drifting toward someone they believed more important. Jeffrey never appeared offended. He actually seemed relieved. The fewer questions people asked, the easier life became. Nora noticed those conversations differently. She watched executives lose interest the moment Jeffrey introduced himself. She watched investors redirect discussions toward wealthier couples. She never said anything that night, nor the next. But small disappointments have a way of collecting. One evening, after another charity gala, she stared out the passenger window as Jeffrey drove home through downtown Seattle. "You know," he glanced over briefly. "What? People judge appearances." "They do. You don't mind?" "No. I do." Jeffrey nodded once, then returned his eyes to the road. "I know." That answer surprised her. She expected reassurance. Instead, she received understanding. Months passed. Nora accepted larger clients. Her commission checks became substantial. She purchased designer clothing with her own earnings. Jeffrey congratulated her every single time. When she closed her first $8 million waterfront property, he cooked her favorite dinner himself. Steak, garlic mashed potatoes, roasted asparagus, a chocolate cake from the bakery she loved. He wrapped no expensive gift. Instead, he framed the newspaper advertisement featuring her listing. She cried when she opened it. "Nobody's ever done something like this for me." Jeffrey only shrugged. It seemed more permanent. She kissed him that evening with complete sincerity. For a while, nothing seemed capable of changing them, but success changes people quietly, never all at once. It changes schedules first, then conversations, then priorities. Nora began working weekends. Client dinners replaced Friday evenings. Phone calls interrupted vacations. She rarely noticed. Jeffrey always did. Still, he never complained. Every morning before leaving for Harbor Point residences, he placed fresh coffee beside her laptop if she was already awake. If she had fallen asleep working, he quietly covered her with a blanket before going to bed himself. The narrator understood something Nora did not. Jeffrey had spent years building habits that asked for nothing in return. Because he had learned long ago that loyalty was measured in ordinary moments, not extraordinary speeches. Unknown even to Nora, Jeffrey had quietly sold a portion of inherited investment assets years earlier. The proceeds paid her graduate school loans before they accumulated crushing interest. The transfer had been arranged anonymously through a family trust. She believed scholarships and careful budgeting had carried her through. Jeffrey never corrected her. Recognition had never interested him. His father's final advice echoed every time he signed another document through the trust. If people only respect your title, they'll never respect you. Jeffrey had never forgotten those words. He intended never to. Late one Tuesday afternoon, Nora arrived home carrying a thick ivory envelope embossed with silver lettering. She opened it immediately. Inside was an invitation to an exclusive investor reception, hosted at Harbor Point Residences. Attendance by invitation only. Seattle's most influential developers would be there. She smiled wider than Jeffrey had seen in months. This could change everything. Jeffrey looked at the address printed beneath the event details. His expression remained calm. Only his fingers paused for the briefest moment against the ceramic coffee mug in his hand. Because the reception wasn't simply taking place inside Harbor Point. It was being held inside the building he had quietly owned for nearly 15 years. The invitation remained on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Heavy ivory cardstock, silver embossed lettering, Harbor Point Residences, investor reception Friday, 7 o'clock. Formal attire required. Every time Nora walked past it, she picked it up again. Every time Jeffrey noticed her reading it, he simply smiled and continued whatever he had been doing. The narrator observed something almost invisible. Jeffrey never once asked whether he would be attending. He already knew the answer. By Thursday afternoon, their apartment looked different. Fresh white lilies stood in crystal vases near the windows overlooking Elliott Bay. A catering company delivered trays of hors d'oeuvres. 2 bottles of Napa Valley Cabernet rested inside an ice bucket. The dining table disappeared beneath polished serving plates borrowed from one of Nora's clients. Jeffrey arrived home shortly after 4 o'clock, wearing faded jeans, a Navy maintenance jacket embroidered with the Harbor Point logo, and work boots carrying traces of concrete dust from a basement equipment room. He quietly removed his boots beside the entrance. Nora glanced toward him before returning to arranging wine glasses. "You got home early." "I finished replacing a circulation pump." "Everything working now?" "It will." She nodded absent-mindedly. Her attention never left the dining table. Jeffrey washed his hands at the kitchen sink. The hot water carried away grease from beneath his fingernails. He watched Seattle's gray afternoon through the window while drying his hands. Rain clouds gathered over Puget Sound. The forecast had been right. Another wet evening. The apartment doorbell rang. Nora hurried across the living room. Standing outside was Vanessa Monroe. Tall, perfectly styled blonde hair, tailored cream pantsuit, designer handbag worth more than Jeffrey's pickup truck. Vanessa entered without waiting to be invited. "Nora, this place looks amazing." Then she noticed Jeffrey. "Oh." Her smile became polite. "Hi, Jeffrey?" "Good afternoon, Vanessa." She looked him over quickly. Maintenance jacket, calloused hands, work boots. Her eyes moved away almost immediately. "Nora Brandon just texted me." "What did he say?" "He's bringing 2 investors from San Francisco." Nora's expression brightened. "They're actually coming?" "They've been looking for premium Seattle properties all year." Jeffrey quietly opened the refrigerator. He removed leftover soup from the previous evening. Neither woman noticed. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. "Is he staying?" Nora hesitated. Only for a second. I'm working on it." Jeffrey heard every word. His expression never changed. He placed the soup inside the microwave. The soft hum filled the silence. Vanessa leaned closer. "You know Brandon." Nora nodded. "He notices everything." "I just don't want tonight to feel..." She searched for a gentler word. "Awkward?" Jeffrey stirred the soup after the microwave beeped. Still no reaction. Still no interruption. The narrator understood why. Jeffrey had spent years listening before speaking. Silence often revealed more than arguments. At 6 o'clock, another knock echoed through the apartment. This time Brandon Hayes entered. He looked exactly like the magazine profiles that frequently featured Seattle's rising developers. Expensive navy suit, perfect haircut, confident smile practiced in boardrooms. He shook Nora's hand warmly. "Everything looks fantastic." "Thank you." Then his eyes settled on Jeffrey. "So you're the maintenance guy Nora married?" Jeffrey extended his hand. "Jeffrey Lewis." Brandon accepted it briefly. His grip lasted less than a second. "I've seen you around Harbor Point." "I imagine you have. You keep the place running." "I try." Brandon laughed. "That's important work." His tone sounded complimentary. His eyes suggested otherwise. Jeffrey simply nodded. Brandon wandered toward the windows overlooking the waterfront. "Incredible view." Nora smiled proudly. "The clients should love it." "They will." Brandon turned back toward Jeffrey. "So," he gestured toward the maintenance jacket. "Long shift today." "Normal day." "I don't know how you do it." Jeffrey waited. Brandon continued. "I'd hate crawling around mechanical rooms all day." Jeffrey answered honestly. "They're usually quieter than boardrooms." Vanessa laughed politely. Brandon forced a smile. Nora looked uncomfortable. The conversation drifted elsewhere. For nearly 20 minutes, Jeffrey remained almost invisible. He cleared dishes, wiped the kitchen counter, refilled the ice bucket. Not because Nora had asked, because he always noticed small things needing attention. Finally, Brandon checked his watch. "The investors will be here in less than 30 minutes, Vanessa nodded. "They're extremely image-conscious." Again, silence settled across the room. This time, Nora broke it. "Jeff." He looked toward her immediately. "Could we talk for a minute?" He followed her onto the balcony overlooking downtown Seattle. Rain had begun. Soft, steady. The city lights reflected across wet streets below. Neither spoke for several seconds. Nora folded her arms against the cool evening air. "You know tonight is important." "I do. I've worked toward opportunities like this for years." "I know." She looked down at the traffic below. "I need everything to go perfectly." Jeffrey waited. She finally turned toward him. "I think—" She stopped, then tried again. "I think it would be better if you weren't here tonight." No accusation, no shouting, just carefully chosen words. Jeffrey studied her face. The narrator remained inside his thoughts, alone. He recognized hesitation, embarrassment, fear of disappointing someone else. But he also recognized something new. Nora was no longer protecting their marriage. She was protecting her reputation. He asked only one question. "Where would you like me to go?" The simplicity of the question surprised her. "I already booked a room." She pointed toward a small overnight bag sitting just inside the balcony door. "I thought, maybe one night." Jeffrey nodded once. "You planned ahead." "I didn't want us arguing." "We aren't." She looked relieved. "I'll explain everything tomorrow." "There won't be any need." She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I understand." She searched his face for anger. There wasn't any. No raised voice, no bitterness, only calm acceptance. Oddly, that hurt more than if he had shouted. Jeffrey stepped back inside. He picked up the overnight bag. It was neatly packed. 2 shirts, a sweater, toothbrush, phone charger. She had thought of everything, except asking whether he wanted to leave. Jeffrey walked into the bedroom. He opened the closet. His eyes briefly settled on framed photographs from happier years. Camping near Mount Rainier. Christmas with friends. Friday dinners on their balcony. He removed one small leather notebook from the bedside drawer and slipped it into his bag. Nothing else. Back in the kitchen, he reached for his wedding ring. For several seconds, he rolled it gently between his fingers. Then he placed it beside his coffee mug. Not dramatically, simply carefully. Nora noticed. "Jeff?" He looked at her. "I'll be back tomorrow." She nodded uncertainly. "I appreciate you understanding." He offered the faint smile she remembered from years ago. "I hope your evening goes well." He opened the apartment door. Outside the hallway security camera quietly tracked the movement. Timestamp: 6:41:18 p.m. Apartment 3407. Resident exiting. A second camera captured him entering the elevator. Another recorded the elevator descending toward the lobby. Another watched him cross the marble floor toward the revolving entrance doors. Jeffrey never looked at any of them. He knew exactly where every camera had been installed. He had approved every location years earlier. Rain greeted him outside. Across the street, black luxury sedans began arriving one after another. Valets hurried beneath umbrellas. Guests stepped onto the sidewalk wearing tuxedos and evening gowns. Inside the lobby, uniformed employees welcomed every visitor with polished smiles. Jeffrey adjusted the strap of his overnight bag, then quietly walked into the rain. Behind him, Harbor Point prepared for one of its most prestigious evenings of the year. Ahead of him, hidden far beneath polished marble floors and elegant speeches, something much larger had already begun moving. Jeffrey Lewis did not check into the hotel Nora had reserved. The reservation remained untouched. Instead, 20 minutes after leaving Harbor Point, he drove his aging Ford F-150 toward Seattle's historic Pioneer Square. The truck blended effortlessly among delivery vans, contractors' pickups, and evening traffic. Nobody looked twice. He parked inside an underground garage beneath a restored brick building whose exterior carried nothing more than a bronze plaque reading Foster Commercial Offices. No company logo, no polished reception, no indication that billions of dollars in commercial property were managed from the upper floors. Jeffrey stepped out carrying the same overnight bag Nora had packed. The security camera above the garage entrance followed him. A second later, the steel door unlocked automatically. "Good evening, Mr. Lewis." The voice came through the intercom before Jeffrey even reached the elevator. "Evening." The elevator required no button. It recognized his security credential inside his wallet. 40 seconds later, the doors opened onto the executive floor. Only 4 offices occupied the entire level. Most lights were already off. Only one conference room remained illuminated. Inside waited 3 people. Margaret Whitmore stood first. She was 61 Harbor Point Development Group's general counsel for nearly 25 years. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she wore reading glasses suspended from a thin gold chain around her neck. Margaret possessed the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades dismantling billion-dollar lawsuits one document at a time. She never rushed. She never guessed. She trusted paper more than promises. Next sat Benjamin Foster. At 56, Harbor Point's chief financial officer still carried the habit of sharpening every pencil before important meetings. His Navy suit looked ordinary compared with those worn by executives across Seattle, but his financial forecasts had guided the company through 3 recessions without a single major property sale. Beside him sat Samuel Ortiz, former Marine, former federal security consultant, now Director of Corporate Security for Harbor Point Development Group. Samuel's tablet remained open beside several printed photographs. He nodded once as Jeffrey entered. Nobody appeared surprised to see the maintenance jacket. Jeffrey wore it into every executive meeting. Margaret smiled gently. "I suspected you'd come straight here." Jeffrey placed the overnight bag beside the conference table. "I had some unexpected free time." Benjamin studied him carefully. Nora, Jeffrey removed his maintenance jacket and hung it neatly over the back of his chair. "She has guests tonight." Nobody asked another question. They understood enough. Samuel quietly slid a folder across the table. "We've confirmed more activity." Jeffrey opened it. Inside were maintenance authorization forms, vendor invoices, contractor approvals. building access logs. At first glance, everything appeared routine. Jeffrey flipped through them slowly. His eyes stopped on one signature, then another, then a third. "They're getting bolder." Benjamin nodded. "They've stopped trying to hide it. For nearly 6 months, Harbor Point Development Group had been conducting an internal review without alerting anyone outside a very small circle. The investigation had begun with something almost insignificant: an air conditioning repair invoice, $38,000. The equipment listed on the invoice had never existed. The payment, however, had. Benjamin initially believed it to be a clerical mistake. Then another appeared. Then another. Each one individually small enough to avoid attracting attention. Together, they represented nearly $2 million. Someone understood corporate accounting very well. Small thefts survived longer than spectacular ones. Jeffrey had approved the investigation personally. Not because of the money, because fraud rarely stayed small. Like rust beneath fresh paint, it always spread farther than anyone realized. Samuel opened another folder. This week's access reports. Color photographs filled the pages. Parking garages, mechanical rooms, storage vaults, electrical control centers. Each photograph carried timestamps, employee identification numbers, security checkpoint records. Samuel pointed toward several highlighted entries. "Notice anything?" Jeffrey studied the pages. 3 different employees. Samuel nodded. "Same access card." Benjamin leaned forward. "Impossible." "It should be." Samuel tapped another page. "The card belonged to a contractor who retired 8 months ago." Silence settled across the room. Jeffrey continued reading. The access card had entered Harbor Point 37 times after the contractor surrendered it. Someone had cloned the credential. Someone inside the building. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "We're beyond internal policy violations." Jeffrey looked up. "I know." She continued calmly. "If these records hold up, we're entering criminal territory." Jeffrey closed the folder. "Not yet." Benjamin frowned. "We already have enough to suspend people. We have enough to become suspicious." "Jeffrey, we don't move because we're suspicious." Margaret understood immediately. "We move when we can prove everything." Jeffrey nodded once. Exactly. That philosophy had guided Harbor Point since his father's time. Never accuse before evidence. Never assume intent. Never confuse coincidence with proof. Many executives considered Jeffrey unusually patient. Only a handful knew patience had once saved his family. 20 years earlier, Harbor Point's founder Jeffrey's father, Richard Lewis, had become one of Seattle's fastest-growing commercial developers. His success attracted admiration. It also attracted dangerous attention. One October evening, Richard's chauffeur noticed an unfamiliar vehicle following them from a charity banquet. He changed routes twice. The vehicle remained behind. Police later uncovered a kidnapping conspiracy targeting Richard during a scheduled public appearance. The plot failed, but it permanently changed the Lewis family. Richard stopped attending public events. Family photographs disappeared from newspapers. Corporate ownership shifted into layered trusts. Public interviews ended. Jeffrey was only 22. He remembered watching federal investigators remove evidence from their family home. He remembered his mother's fear every time an unfamiliar car parked outside. Most vividly, he remembered something his father said only weeks later. "If people cannot find the owner, they cannot threaten the family." Richard never returned to public life. When he died years later following a sudden heart attack, Jeffrey inherited Harbor Point through a carefully structured family trust. Almost nobody knew. Even most executives believed ownership rested with anonymous investment funds. Only Margaret, Benjamin, Samuel, and 2 trustees understood the truth. Jeffrey insisted the arrangement remain unchanged. "I don't want employees treating me differently." Benjamin had argued against the idea. "You're the chairman." I'm also responsible for knowing how this company actually operates. So Jeffrey accepted the title privately, then applied for an internal maintenance position under his own name. The irony amused him. The owner interviewed for a maintenance job inside his own building. He answered every question honestly. He passed every technical certification. Within weeks, he began replacing pumps, inspecting boilers, repairing elevators, and greeting residents each morning before sunrise. He learned far more walking service corridors than sitting inside boardrooms. He learned which managers respected janitors, which supervisors ignored safety rules, which vendors overcharged, which employees stayed late without overtime simply because residents depended on them. No executive report could reveal those things. Only work could. Samuel interrupted Jeffrey's thoughts. We found something else. He projected a floor plan onto the conference room screen. Blueprints covered the wall. Red circles marked 6 locations inside Harbor Point. Mechanical rooms, storage areas, service elevators. Samuel spoke quietly. Every fraudulent contractor invoice traces back to these locations. Benjamin looked confused. They're unrelated systems. They appear unrelated. Samuel zoomed in, but they're connected through maintenance authorizations. Jeffrey stood. He walked closer to the screen. His eyes narrowed. Every highlighted location required approval from one department before outside vendors could enter. Facilities coordination. A department recently reorganized. Jeffrey spoke almost to himself. Who approved the restructuring? Benjamin answered. The recommendation came from Brandon Hayes. The room became completely silent. Brandon Hayes. The same developer attending Nora's investor reception tonight. The same man who had shaken Jeffrey's hand only hours earlier. The same man who laughed about maintenance work while standing inside Jeffrey's apartment. Margaret slowly closed her notebook. I think tonight just became more important than any of us realized. Jeffrey remained staring at the blueprints. Outside the conference room windows, Seattle's rain continued falling over the city. Inside Harbor Point, champagne glasses were already being filled. Guests laughed. Investors exchanged business cards. Nora welcomed Seattle's wealthiest developers with practiced confidence. None of them knew that only a few miles away, the building's true owner had just connected the first visible thread between an elegant investment gala and what was rapidly becoming a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. By 7:30 that evening, Harbor Point residences looked less like a residential tower and more like a private country club. Luxury sedans lined the circular driveway. Valets moved with practiced efficiency beneath black umbrellas. Inside the grand lobby, a jazz trio played softly beneath a crystal chandelier that reflected hundreds of warm lights across polished marble floors. Residents passing through paused for a moment before continuing toward private elevators. Some recognized familiar faces from local business magazines. Others simply admired the elegance of the evening. On the 34th floor, laughter drifted from Nora's apartment. She stood near the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, while introducing guests to one another with effortless confidence. Only hours earlier, she had watched Jeffrey leave without protest. She had expected to feel guilty. Instead, she mostly felt relieved. The evening could finally proceed exactly as she had planned. Brandon Hayes moved comfortably through the room. He had mastered the art of making every conversation sound exclusive. One investor believed Brandon possessed inside knowledge of Seattle's next luxury expansion district. Another assumed he had direct access to Harbor Point's executive leadership. Brandon encouraged both assumptions without ever confirming either. Confidence often sounded like authority. Vanessa Monroe remained close beside Nora. You did the right thing. Nora looked away from the crowd. I keep telling myself that. You needed tonight. I know. Jeffrey would never fit into this room. Nora did not answer. Instead, she glanced toward the apartment entrance. Empty. No maintenance jacket. No old work boots. No quiet husband standing awkwardly near the kitchen. Everything looked exactly as she had imagined. Yet something felt strangely incomplete. The narrator remained inside Jeffrey's perspective, but even from miles away, one truth became obvious. Sometimes absence occupied more space than presence. Across the city, Jeffrey sat alone inside the Harbor Point executive conference room. Most of the lights had been dimmed. Only one large monitor remained active. Samuel Ortiz adjusted several windows across the screen. Authorized security feeds, lobby, loading dock, parking garage, executive elevators, ballroom entrance, mechanical corridors. Every camera displayed live images. Jeffrey watched without expression. Not because he wanted to monitor Nora, because Harbor Point itself had become evidence. Samuel folded his arms. The gala gives them cover. Benjamin looked up from another financial report. Large crowds. Busy elevators. Outside vendors. Temporary staff. Samuel nodded. Exactly. When everyone's distracted, people stop noticing unusual movement. Jeffrey continued watching the parking garage feed. Delivery vehicles entered. Caterers, florists, audio technicians, cleaning contractors. Every arrival generated paperwork. Every departure left a digital record, normally, unless someone intentionally bypassed procedure. Samuel enlarged one camera. A white service van slowly entered through the underground entrance. Nothing unusual. Except one detail. No company logo. Benjamin leaned closer. Who authorized them? Samuel checked his tablet. No work order. Jeffrey watched silently. The van parked near the freight elevators. Two men climbed out, dark jackets, tool cases, safety helmets, completely ordinary. Too ordinary. One man swiped an access card. The elevator doors opened immediately. Jeffrey spoke quietly. Freeze that frame. Samuel paused the image. Jeffrey stepped closer. Zoom in. The photograph sharpened. The access badge hung upside down. An experienced maintenance technician never wore an identification badge upside down. It made scanning slower. Small mistake, easy to overlook. Jeffrey noticed because he had worn one every day for years. Samuel checked employee records. No match. Benjamin frowned. They're using cloned credentials again. Jeffrey nodded once. Track the elevator? Camera after camera followed the men upward. Basement, service level, mechanical floor, then nothing. They disappeared, Samuel typed rapidly. No exit. No stairwell cameras. No elevator. Benjamin looked confused. How Jeffrey already knew. There are only two possibilities. Samuel looked toward him. They entered an area without camera coverage. Or someone disabled the cameras. Samuel opened another diagnostic screen. His face tightened. We just lost 3 interior feeds. Benjamin stood immediately. They're inside. Jeffrey remained seated. Restore the recordings. I'm trying. Samuel worked quickly. After several seconds, the screens returned. Nothing appeared unusual. Empty corridors, closed mechanical doors, silent equipment rooms. Yet Jeffrey knew something had changed. People planning fraud rarely made mistakes. People becoming desperate did. Meanwhile, 34 floors above Brandon raised his wine glass. To Seattle's future. Guests applauded politely. Several investors gathered around him. One of them, Charles Whitaker from San Francisco, studied a large architectural rendering displayed beside the windows. Beautiful project. Brandon smiled. It can be even larger. In what way? We're exploring ownership opportunities. Charles raised an eyebrow. I thought Harbor Point wasn't available. Brandon lowered his voice. Everything has an owner. Charles smiled. Can you actually reach them? I know people. Another investor joined them. Anonymous ownership always complicates negotiations. Brandon laughed softly. Not for much longer. Across the room, Nora overheard only fragments: ownership, negotiations, expansion. She assumed Brandon was discussing future business opportunities. She had no idea how confidently he was speaking about property that legally belonged to Jeffrey. Vanessa approached carrying another tray of drinks. You look distracted. I'm fine. You should enjoy this. I am? Then smile. Nora forced one. It looked convincing enough. Back inside the executive office, Benjamin placed another folder before Jeffrey. We finished tracing the vendor payments. Jeffrey opened the report. Every suspicious invoice eventually flowed toward 3 shell companies: North Crest Services, Emerald Mechanical Solutions, Rain City Facilities. Different names, different addresses. Same bank. Same registered accountant. Benjamin tapped one highlighted section. The accountant resigned 6 months ago. So who filed the reports? No one knows. Jeffrey slowly turned another page. His eyes stopped. There it was. A familiar signature. Not Brandon's. Not any executive's. Someone else's. Jeffrey recognized it instantly, because he had approved that employee's hiring personally almost 8 years earlier. Who has custody of Michael Donovan? Samuel looked up. The facilities coordination manager? Yes, Benjamin answered quietly. He's on vacation. Jeffrey looked at him. For 3 weeks. Samuel frowned. He requested leave yesterday. Jeffrey closed the folder. No. Benjamin blinked. What? He didn't. Silence returned. Jeffrey's memory rarely failed him. Michael Donovan had scheduled family leave months earlier. Not yesterday. Someone had altered personnel records. Benjamin immediately opened human resources files. 30 seconds later, his expression changed. The approval timestamp. He stopped speaking. What? It was modified tonight. Samuel turned sharply. By whom? Benjamin searched system logs, then slowly looked at Jeffrey. Someone using executive administrative credentials. Nobody spoke. That was no longer financial fraud. That was active interference with company records while the gala continued upstairs. Samuel picked up his phone. I'll notify Seattle Financial Crimes. Jeffrey shook his head. Not yet. Samuel stared. We're running out of time. I know. They're changing evidence. They're exposing themselves. Margaret entered the conference room carrying another legal file. I've just finished speaking with Superior Court. Everyone looked toward her. The judge is prepared to issue preservation orders first thing tomorrow morning. Samuel exhaled. Tomorrow may be too late. Margaret met Jeffrey's eyes. I agree. She placed a sealed envelope on the table. The detectives are waiting for your decision. Jeffrey rested one hand on the envelope. He did not open it, not immediately. Instead, he looked once more toward the live security monitor. On the screen, Brandon Hayes laughed with investors beneath Harbor Point's crystal chandeliers. Nora stood beside him, smiling politely, completely unaware that every passing minute tightened the legal circle around the people she trusted most. Jeffrey finally spoke. Call Detective Emily Carter. Samuel immediately reached for his phone. Jeffrey added one final instruction: no arrests. Benjamin looked surprised. Even now? Jeffrey nodded. Not until every piece fits. Outside thunder rolled across the Seattle skyline. Inside Harbor Point, another toast echoed through the ballroom. Neither sound was as powerful as the quiet click of Samuel dialing the detective who would soon begin unraveling everything. Detective Emily Carter answered on the second ring. Samuel switched the call to speaker. Detective Carter. This is Samuel Ortiz. I expected your call. Jeffrey looked up. You did. Emily's voice remained calm. We've been watching several financial transfers connected to Harbor Point for weeks. Your message yesterday confirmed we were looking at the same people. Margaret exchanged a brief glance with Benjamin. Jeffrey leaned forward. What do you have? I'd rather discuss it in person. When? I'm already downstairs. Samuel walked toward the conference room window overlooking the private parking entrance. A dark gray Seattle police SUV rolled quietly beneath the security gate. No flashing lights, no sirens, just another vehicle entering an office garage on a rainy Friday evening. She's here. Jeffrey stood. Bring her up. 5 minutes later, Detective Emily Carter entered the executive floor carrying 2 thick evidence boxes. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a navy business suit beneath a raincoat instead of a police uniform. Only the leather badge clipped to her belt identified her as law enforcement. She shook Jeffrey's hand. Mr. Lewis. Detective. I appreciate your discretion. I appreciate yours. Emily placed both evidence boxes onto the conference table. I've read enough about Harbor Point to know why anonymity matters. Jeffrey nodded. Then you also know I'd like to keep it that way. For as long as possible. She opened the first box. Inside were binders, digital storage drives, subpoena records, and enlarged financial charts. Benjamin stared. You've been busy. Emily smiled slightly. We've had reason. She unfolded a large flowchart across the conference table. More than 30 companies appeared connected through a web of arrows: construction firms, maintenance vendors, consulting agencies, property management services. At first glance, they seemed unrelated. Closer inspection revealed something different. Money flowed through each company before arriving in only 2 accounts. Emily pointed at the center. Every fraudulent payment eventually lands here. Benjamin adjusted his glasses. Blue Harbor Consulting and Northwest Urban Advisors. Samuel looked at the corporate registration. Both companies were incorporated 18 months ago. Emily nodded. They share one mailing address. Margaret looked towards Jeffrey. Shell corporations. Emily continued. They have no employees. No physical offices. No active construction equipment. No maintenance licenses. Benjamin quietly finished the sentence. They only receive money. Emily smiled once. Exactly. Jeffrey studied the chart without speaking. The narrator followed only his thoughts. Fraud never begins with greed. It begins with opportunity. Someone inside Harbor Point had discovered a system that trusted paperwork. Once false invoices entered accounting, every approval afterward became easier. Emily opened another binder. We've subpoenaed banking records. Benjamin's eyebrows rose. You already obtained warrants. We had another investigation. What investigation? Emily turned several pages. Commercial property fraud involving 3 luxury buildings in Bellevue. Samuel looked towards Jeffrey. The pattern. Emily nodded. Identical. Fake maintenance contracts, inflated repair invoices, temporary shell companies, electronic approval chains. Everything looked legitimate. Until forensic accountants examined every transfer. Jeffrey asked quietly, How much? Emily answered without hesitation. Across all properties. She looked down briefly. Approximately $48 million. The room became completely silent. Benjamin slowly removed his glasses. 48? Emily nodded. We believe Harbor Point is the next target. Jeffrey remained remarkably calm. Not the next. Everyone looked at him. They're already inside. Emily watched him carefully. I was hoping you'd say that. Samuel slid another folder across the table. Our cloned access cards. Emily opened it immediately. Good. Then another. Our surveillance timelines. She nodded again. Excellent. Benjamin added financial spreadsheets. Emily smiled. I wish every corporate victim preserved evidence this carefully. Margaret answered quietly. Jeffrey insisted we never move too early. Emily looked toward him. That decision probably saved this investigation. She pulled a flash drive from her pocket. My turn. Samuel connected it to the conference room display. Security footage appeared. Different building, different city, luxury condominium garage, 3 men unloading tool cases from an unmarked service van. Benjamin leaned forward. The same van. Emily froze one frame. One man's face became clearly visible. Samuel inhaled sharply. I know him. Jeffrey looked over. Who? His name is Travis Nolan. Emily nodded. You've met? Samuel answered immediately. He worked maintenance at Harbor Point 3 years ago. What happened? He resigned. Emily corrected him. He disappeared. Another photograph appeared. Travis Nolan entering a bank. Then another. Meeting with contractors. Then another. Standing beside Brandon Hayes outside a waterfront restaurant. Benjamin looked at Jeffrey. There he is. Brandon. No longer just a confident developer, now appearing repeatedly beside a suspect linked to organized financial fraud. Emily spoke carefully. We still don't have enough to arrest Brandon. Jeffrey nodded. But you're getting closer. We are. Margaret folded her hands. What exactly do you need? Emily answered immediately. Intent. Benjamin frowned. We already have fraudulent payments. Payments prove theft. What doesn't it prove? Who planned it? She looked around the room. If Brandon claims he unknowingly approved invoices submitted by contractors, Margaret finished quietly. Reasonable doubt. Emily nodded. We need evidence connecting him directly to decision-making. Jeffrey remained thoughtful. Then we don't have enough. Emily appreciated the answer. Most executives demanded arrests long before investigations were complete. Jeffrey asked only whether the evidence met legal standards. That told her everything she needed to know about him. She opened the second evidence box. This arrived yesterday. Inside rested copies of Harbor Point vendor applications, insurance certificates, licensing documents, equipment inspection reports. Every page appeared authentic, until Emily pointed toward a single line. The insurance company. Benjamin read it aloud. Pacific Commercial Mutual. He looked confused. I've heard of them. Emily shook her head. You've heard the name? It doesn't exist. Benjamin looked again. Margaret immediately understood. The policy numbers. Emily smiled. Everyone is fake. Samuel exhaled slowly. They forged entire insurance certificates. Emily nodded. They expected accounting staff to verify only expiration dates. Jeffrey turned another page. Every forged document had one thing in common. Approval recommendation. Facilities Coordination Department. The same department Brandon Hayes had persuaded Harbor Point to reorganize. Benjamin looked sick. We handed them the keys. Jeffrey answered quietly. No. Benjamin looked toward him. We handed them trust. Emily watched Jeffrey for several moments. Most property owners she investigated became emotional when discovering fraud. Angry, humiliated, vindictive. Jeffrey became quieter. That worried her more. Not because she feared violence, because calm people usually thought several steps ahead. She closed the evidence box. I have one recommendation. Jeffrey nodded. Go ahead. Do nothing tonight. Samuel looked surprised. Nothing, Emily continued. If they're changing records during the gala, they're nervous. Jeffrey completed the thought. They'll make mistakes. Emily smiled. And mistakes create evidence. Benjamin folded his arms. What if they destroy documents? Emily shook her head. We already preserved banking records, Margaret added, and electronic backups. Samuel smiled faintly. Plus 6 redundant security servers. Jeffrey stood and walked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Far away, Harbor Point rose above the city lights. Elegant, peaceful, completely unaware that investigators from 2 different directions had finally reached the same conclusion. Emily joined him near the glass. When were you planning to tell your wife? Jeffrey remained looking toward the skyline. I wasn't. You never intended to tell her you're the owner? No? Emily waited. Jeffrey finally spoke again. I wanted her to know me, not my title. The detective said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. Sometimes the saddest evidence in an investigation never appeared inside a courtroom. It appeared inside ordinary conversations. Samuel's phone vibrated. He answered immediately. After only 10 seconds, he looked toward Jeffrey. They're moving. Who? The 2 men from the white service van. Samuel enlarged another live camera feed. The men had reappeared inside Harbor Point's restricted maintenance corridor. One carried a black equipment case. The other held a sealed document envelope. Instead of leaving through the loading dock, they walked directly toward the Executive Records Archive. Emily Carter's expression changed instantly. That's not maintenance. Jeffrey looked once at the live screen, then toward Margaret. Prepare the original ownership records. Benjamin. Freeze every financial server. Samuel. Keep recording. Finally, Jeffrey turned to Detective Carter. I believe they're about to give you the evidence you've been waiting for. The Executive Records Archive occupied one of the most secure areas inside Harbor Point Development Group. Unlike the glamorous residential tower across downtown Seattle, this office building had been designed with quiet efficiency rather than luxury. Thick concrete walls surrounded the records vault. Every entry required 2 forms of authentication, and every door opening generated a permanent digital log. Jeffrey had insisted on those safeguards years earlier. At the time, several executives argued the system was excessive. Now, no one questioned it. Samuel Ortiz enlarged the live camera feed. The 2 men from the white service van stopped outside the archive corridor. One looked both directions. The other removed a small electronic device from his toolcase. Emily Carter leaned closer to the monitor. Pause. Samuel froze the image. Emily pointed toward the device. That's not maintenance equipment. Samuel nodded. Signal interceptor. Benjamin frowned. What does it do? It briefly interrupts electronic communication between access readers and the security network. Benjamin looked confused. So they can unlock the door? Samuel shook his head. No. They can make it appear the door never opened. Margaret quietly closed the legal file in front of her. They've done this before. Emily answered. More than once. Samuel resumed the recording. The device flashed once, then twice. A green light appeared on the archive door. The men disappeared inside. Benjamin looked toward Jeffrey. They're in. Jeffrey never looked away from the monitor. Start the timer. Samuel checked his watch. 7:48. No one spoke. Inside the archive, hidden cameras continued recording. Rows of fireproof cabinets stretched across the room. Each cabinet contained decades of corporate history, property deeds, construction permits, insurance policies, ownership certificates, board resolutions. Every document that proved Harbor Point legally existed. The 2 intruders moved with confidence. One headed directly toward cabinet C-17. Emily immediately noticed. They know exactly where they're going. Samuel nodded. Inside information. The first man unlocked the cabinet. The second opened the black equipment case. Instead of removing tools, he produced a portable scanner. Benjamin frowned. They're copying documents. Emily shook her head. Wait. The scanner remained inside the case. The man reached beneath it. He removed several folded folders. Margaret's eyes narrowed. They brought replacement files. The room fell silent. Jeffrey understood immediately. They're not stealing records. They're rewriting history. Samuel zoomed closer. The camera captured every movement. Original ownership documents left the cabinet. Replacement documents entered. Everything happened calmly, methodically, as though the men had rehearsed the procedure many times before. Emily slowly smiled. There it is. Benjamin looked toward her. What? Intent. She pointed at the screen. If they intended only theft, they'd remove documents. They're replacing them. That proves planning, Margaret added quietly. And conspiracy. Jeffrey folded his arms. Keep recording. Nobody interrupted. The men continued exchanging page after page. Corporate amendments, property ownership schedules, trust documentation, executive resolutions. Every forged document carried new signatures, new dates, new approval chains. Samuel captured high-resolution still photographs every 30 seconds. Emily documented timestamps beside each image. The investigation had just changed. 20 minutes earlier, they possessed financial irregularities. Now they were watching an organized attempt to falsify ownership records. Benjamin looked physically unsettled. They're trying to take Harbor Point, Margaret corrected him. They're trying to make it look like they already have. Jeffrey remained unusually calm, because he had expected something like this long before tonight. Years earlier, when restructuring Harbor Point's legal protections, he instructed Margaret to separate original ownership records into 3 independent locations. The archive held certified copies, not originals. The authentic documents rested inside a climate-controlled trust vault nearly 30 miles away. Only Margaret and 2 trustees possessed access. If anyone altered the archive, they would only create evidence against themselves. Emily glanced toward Jeffrey. You anticipated this, he answered honestly. My father did. She waited. Jeffrey continued. He always believed paper attracts thieves. So he protected the originals. Several times over. Margaret smiled slightly. Richard Lewis trusted very few things. What did he trust? Documentation. Emily nodded. Smart man. Meanwhile, 34 floors above Harbor Point's residential lobby, Brandon Hayes appeared completely relaxed. He stood beside a scale model of Seattle's waterfront, discussing future investment opportunities. Charles Whitaker studied the display. You seem remarkably confident. Brandon smiled. I've learned confidence attracts opportunity. Charles chuckled. Only when it's justified. It is. What makes you so certain? Brandon took a sip of wine. Because ownership is about to become simpler. Charles laughed. I like optimistic people. Across the room, Nora noticed Brandon's unusually good mood. She approached quietly. Everything all right? Better than all right? You look like you've already closed the deal. Brandon smiled. Some deals close before people realize negotiations even started. Nora assumed he meant another investment partnership. She smiled politely. I hope tonight helps. It already has. The narrator remained with Jeffrey's perspective. If he had heard Brandon's words, they would have confirmed exactly what the evidence already suggested. Confidence often becomes careless moments before collapse. Back inside the executive conference room, Samuel received another alert. Movement. The men had finished replacing documents. Instead of leaving immediately, one walked toward another cabinet. Jeffrey recognized the label. Board resolutions. Samuel zoomed further. The second man removed a flash drive. Emily immediately stood. They're copying digital archives, too. Benjamin looked alarmed. Can they access the server? Samuel answered. No. But they can steal encrypted backups. Jeffrey looked toward him. Can they decrypt them? Samuel smiled faintly. Not in this lifetime. Jeffrey nodded. Good. Emily watched the monitors carefully. The important part is possession. If they're carrying stolen encrypted data, then we establish another criminal act. Exactly. The first intruder checked his watch. Both men repacked their equipment, then quietly exited the archive. Samuel immediately switched cameras. Hallway, elevator, service corridor, freight lift, parking garage. Every movement remained recorded. Emily looked toward Jeffrey. They're leaving. Jeffrey remained thoughtful. No. Emily frowned. What do you mean? They're delivering. Benjamin understood first. Someone's waiting. Samuel accelerated another camera. Outside the underground garage, a black Mercedes-Benz sedan slowly entered through the private vehicle entrance. The license plate appeared clearly. Emily's expression changed. I know that car. Samuel enlarged the image. Driver's side door opened. A man stepped out carrying an umbrella, tailored charcoal overcoat, Italian leather shoes, perfectly styled hair despite the rain. Brandon Hayes. Benjamin stared at the screen. He came himself. Emily quietly reached for her phone. Jeffrey gently raised one hand. Wait. She stopped. They're about to exchange evidence. Jeffrey nodded. If detectives move now, they'll abandon the transfer. Emily understood. If we wait, we identify everyone involved. Samuel switched to another hidden garage camera. The two intruders approached Brandon's vehicle. No words, no handshake. One simply handed Brandon the sealed document envelope. The other passed him the encrypted drive. Brandon slipped both items into a leather briefcase. Then he looked around the garage, only briefly, just enough to reassure himself no one had noticed. Unfortunately for him, 7 cameras had. Emily quietly whispered, "That's conspiracy." Margaret added, "Possession of falsified corporate records." Benjamin finished, "And stolen company data." Jeffrey watched Brandon climb back into the Mercedes. His face remained unreadable. Not satisfaction, not anger, only certainty. Years of preparation, months of investigation, hours of patient observation. Everything had finally converged. Emily slowly closed her notebook. I can request arrest warrants before sunrise. Jeffrey looked toward her. I'd rather you request search warrants first. She studied him carefully. Still protecting procedure? Always. Emily smiled. I've interviewed hundreds of CEOs. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. And you're the first one who keeps asking for more evidence instead of faster arrests. Jeffrey answered quietly. If the truth is strong enough, it never needs to hurry. Before Emily could respond, Samuel's tablet vibrated again. Another live notification. This one came from Harbor Point's residential lobby. He opened the camera feed. A concierge stepped toward Brandon just as he entered the building again. The concierge handed him a sealed envelope. Brandon signed for it, opened it immediately. His confident smile disappeared. Benjamin leaned closer. What is it? Samuel enhanced the image. Only 6 words were visible across the first page. Emergency board meeting. Mandatory attendance. Tomorrow. 8 a.m. Jeffrey looked at Margaret. You sent those? She nodded once. To every executive. Jeffrey turned back towards the screen. For the first time that evening, Brandon Hayes no longer looked like the man in control. Saturday morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds that covered Seattle from Elliott Bay Hunt to Lake Washington. Rain had stopped before sunrise. The streets remained wet. Harbor Point residences reflected the pale morning light like polished glass, calm and elegant, giving no hint that an entire criminal investigation had accelerated beneath its foundation overnight. At 7 o'clock, Jeffrey Lewis arrived before everyone else. He parked his aging Ford F-150 in the employee lot instead of the executive garage. The security guard at the entrance smiled. "Morning, Jeff." "Morning, Eric." "You're here early. Got a few things to inspect." "Elevator 4 has been making noise again." "I'll take a look." Nothing about the conversation sounded unusual. To Eric, Jeffrey remained exactly who he had always appeared to be, the maintenance supervisor. Reliable, quiet, always the first to arrive. Jeffrey carried a black maintenance toolbox toward the service elevator. Inside the toolbox rested no wrench, no screwdriver. Instead, it contained copies of legal preservation orders prepared overnight by Margaret Whitmore. Corporate meeting agendas, building access reports. Nothing more. Everything less dramatic than most people would expect. Jeffrey believed important mornings usually began with paperwork, not speeches. As the service elevator climbed toward the executive offices, Samuel Ortiz watched more than 80 security cameras from Harbor Point Surveillance Center. Additional recording servers had been activated before dawn. Every entrance, every hallway, every elevator, every conference room, every loading dock, everything would be documented, no exceptions. Samuel spoke quietly into his headset. "Chairman entering executive level." The title still sounded unusual. Only 3 people inside Harbor Point regularly used it. Jeffrey never asked anyone to. 8 minutes later, Margaret arrived carrying 2 leather document cases. Benjamin followed immediately behind her. Neither spoke about the previous evening. There was no need. Every development had already been preserved, indexed, duplicated, and secured before sunrise. Margaret placed the larger document case onto the conference table. The originals from the trust vault arrived at 6:15. Jeffrey nodded. "No issues." "None." Benjamin looked relieved. "The trustees?" "They're prepared to testify if necessary." Jeffrey thanked her quietly. Nothing more. At 7:45, Detective Emily Carter entered with 2 assistant detectives from Seattle Police Financial Crimes. Unlike the previous evening, all 3 now wore official credentials. Emily greeted Jeffrey with a brief handshake. "Search warrants have been approved." Margaret accepted certified copies immediately. Emily continued. "Digital seizure authority. Financial preservation. Document recovery. Electronic communications." Benjamin looked toward Jeffrey. "We're ready," Jeffrey answered calmly. "Almost." Emily understood immediately. "You're waiting for Brandon." Jeffrey nodded once. At exactly 7:58, the executive elevator opened. Brandon Hayes stepped out first. His confidence had returned overnight. He wore a charcoal Italian suit, polished black shoes, and a smile carefully designed to suggest complete control. Behind him came Vanessa Monroe. She carried a leather portfolio and several presentation folders. Nora followed several steps behind. She had barely slept. The previous night's celebration had ended well after midnight, yet Brandon insisted everyone attend the emergency board meeting personally. Nora assumed Harbor Point's anonymous ownership group had finally agreed to discuss future investment opportunities. She still had no idea why Jeffrey had been strangely absent from every conversation since leaving the apartment. The conference room doors opened automatically. Brandon entered without hesitation, then stopped. Jeffrey sat quietly at the far end of the conference table. Still wearing work boots, still wearing a simple Navy maintenance jacket. A yellow legal pad rested beside him, nothing else. Brandon laughed softly. "Jeff." Jeffrey looked up. "Morning." Brandon glanced toward Margaret. "I didn't realize maintenance supervisors attended executive meetings." Margaret did not respond. Neither did Benjamin. Brandon smiled politely. "I assume he's fixing something." Jeffrey answered. "Eventually." Vanessa looked uncomfortable. She recognized Margaret Whitmore immediately. Every major real estate transaction in Seattle involved her firm sooner or later. Seeing Harbor Point's general counsel sitting beside Jeffrey made little sense. Nora noticed the same thing. Her eyes moved from Margaret to Benjamin to Samuel, then finally back to Jeffrey. She felt the first quiet stir of confusion. Brandon took a seat halfway down the table. "So," he folded his hands, "what's so urgent?" Margaret calmly distributed meeting packets, one to Brandon, one to Vanessa, one to Nora. One remained in front of Jeffrey. Brandon glanced at the cover page. Emergency Corporate Governance Review. He smiled. "I've attended worse." Emily Carter and the two detectives quietly entered the room. Brandon's smile faded slightly. He looked toward Margaret. "I wasn't aware law enforcement had joined the board." Emily answered before Margaret could. "We haven't. We're observing." Brandon recovered quickly. "I'm sure there's an explanation." "There is." Jeffrey finally spoke. His voice remained exactly as calm as it had always been. "Please open the first page." Brandon did. Inside rested a chart of contractor payments. He barely looked at it. "Accounting." Jeffrey nodded. "Continue." Second page. Vendor registrations. Third page. Access logs. Fourth page. Insurance certificates. Brandon's expression remained controlled. Only his eyes moved slightly faster. Vanessa turned each page more slowly. Nora looked increasingly puzzled. She whispered, "What are we reviewing?" No one answered. Jeffrey allowed silence to do the work. Finally, Brandon placed the packet on the table. "I fail to see the issue." Margaret folded her hands. "The issue is fraud." Brandon looked directly at her. "That's a serious accusation." "It is." Emily Carter placed a small evidence envelope onto the table. "So we don't make it lightly." Brandon glanced toward the detectives. "What exactly is this?" Emily answered. "A cloned Harbor Point security credential." Another envelope appeared. "A forged insurance certificate." Another. "A falsified contractor license." Then another. "Bank transfer records." Brandon remained composed. "Interesting." Jeffrey watched him carefully. The narrator observed only Jeffrey's thoughts. People under pressure often revealed themselves through timing, not words. Brandon looked at the evidence for less than 3 seconds before responding. Too quickly. Someone seeing those documents for the first time would naturally study them. Brandon didn't. Almost as though he already knew what they contained. Jeffrey quietly wrote one sentence onto his yellow legal pad. Samuel, watching from across the table, noticed it immediately. He said nothing. Emily continued. "Mr. Hayes, we also recovered surveillance footage." Brandon shrugged. "From where?" "Our executive archive." That answer finally produced the smallest visible reaction. Only a tightening of the jaw. Barely noticeable. Jeffrey noticed. Emily noticed. Margaret noticed. Nora did not. Brandon leaned back comfortably. "I'm not sure why any of this concerns me." Emily smiled slightly. "We'll get there." Samuel pressed a button on the conference room remote. The lights dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. Brandon glanced toward it. His confidence remained. For now. The first image appeared. Timestamp. 7:48 p.m., Executive Archive Corridor. 2 men entering with maintenance equipment. Brandon looked without expression. "I don't recognize them." Second image. The same men replacing corporate records. No reaction. Third image. The men exiting with a sealed envelope. Still nothing. Then Samuel advanced one more frame. Underground parking garage, black Mercedes-Benz, license plate clearly visible. Brandon's own vehicle. The room became perfectly silent. Next image. Brandon accepting the sealed envelope from the two men, then receiving the encrypted drive, then placing both into his leather briefcase. Every timestamp, every camera angle, every movement, documented. Brandon's smile disappeared completely. Across the table, Nora slowly turned her head toward him. She had never seen those men before. She had never heard about the archive. She had no explanation for any of it. For the first time since yesterday afternoon, she forgot entirely about Jeffrey. All of her attention focused on Brandon. Emily Carter quietly closed the evidence folder. "We're finished showing still photographs." She looked toward Samuel. "Play the video." Samuel reached for the remote. The conference room lights dimmed even further. On the large screen, the surveillance recording began to move. The video began without sound, only timestamps, only movement, only facts. The first recording showed the executive archive corridor at 7:48:13 p.m. Two men entered carrying identical black equipment cases. One paused briefly beneath the security camera. The other removed a small electronic device from his pocket. Samuel froze the frame. "Signal interruption device." He advanced the recording. The archive door unlocked. Both men disappeared inside. No narration followed. The footage spoke for itself. Emily Carter let the silence stretch across the conference room. She had learned long ago that evidence became more powerful when people were forced to watch it without interruption. Brandon kept his eyes on the screen. His face remained controlled. Too controlled. Nora shifted uneasily in her chair. "What archive is this?" Margaret answered calmly. "The Executive Records Archive." Nora frowned. "I've never even heard of it." "You weren't supposed to." Samuel resumed the recording. Inside the archive, hidden cameras captured every movement from multiple angles. The two intruders opened cabinet C-17. Original files came out. Replacement files went in. Corporate resolutions. Property schedules. Ownership certificates. Everything was exchanged with careful precision. Vanessa whispered almost to herself, "Oh my God." Brandon remained silent. Emily pressed pause. "Mr. Hayes." He looked at her. "Yes." "Have you ever been inside that archive?" "No." "Do you know either of these men?" "I don't." Emily nodded as though accepting the answer. "Please continue watching." The next sequence appeared. The parking garage, 7:59:41 p.m. The white service van stopped beside a black Mercedes-Benz. Two men approached. One handed over a sealed document envelope. The other passed a black encrypted drive. The driver accepted both. Samuel enlarged the image until the driver's face filled the screen. Brandon Hayes. No one spoke. The video continued. Brandon placed both items into his leather briefcase. He looked around the garage, then drove away. Samuel stopped the recording. The room remained completely silent. Emily folded her hands. "Mr. Hayes." Brandon finally exhaled. "I can explain." Jeffrey looked at him for the first time since the meeting began. "Please do." Brandon straightened his jacket. "I'm a developer. I meet contractors every week. They told me they had documents concerning future ownership discussions." Emily asked, "What kind of ownership discussions?" "I assumed investment proposals." Margaret opened one of the document cases beside her. "You assumed these men removed confidential corporate records and delivered them to you." As part of an investment proposal." Brandon hesitated. "They never said they removed anything." Emily answered quietly. "They didn't need to." She slid another photograph across the table. This image was taken 38 seconds before the exchange. It showed one of the intruders carrying the same sealed envelope directly out of the archive. The envelope displayed a distinctive blue Harbor Point security seal. The identical seal remained visible on the envelope Brandon accepted. Emily asked, "Still an investment proposal?" Brandon said nothing. Vanessa slowly leaned away from him. The confidence she admired the night before had begun to disappear. Nora looked from the photographs to Brandon, then toward Jeffrey. Jeffrey had not spoken another word. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He simply watched. That unsettled her more than anything else. Emily opened another folder. "We executed search warrants at 6 this morning." Brandon looked up sharply. "You searched my office?" "We searched several locations." She removed a transparent evidence bag. Inside rested the same leather briefcase visible in the surveillance footage. "We recovered this." Brandon's expression hardened. "My attorney." "You'll have every opportunity to speak with your attorney." Emily interrupted politely. She continued removing evidence. The sealed envelope, the encrypted drive, replacement ownership certificates, forged board resolutions, counterfeit trust amendments. One by one they appeared across the conference table. Benjamin quietly shook his head. "They actually intended to replace the ownership chain." Margaret answered, "They intended to control it." Emily picked up one document. "This certificate identifies Harbor Point Development Group as majority owned by Northwest Urban Advisors." Benjamin laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because the forgery was almost unbelievable. "Northwest Urban Advisors doesn't own a single square foot of this building." Emily nodded. "We know." Brandon finally spoke again. "Those papers aren't mine. They were found inside your briefcase." "I didn't know what they were." Jeffrey quietly asked his first question. "When did you intend to use them?" Brandon turned toward him. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jeffrey remained calm. "You told investors last night ownership would become simpler." Brandon froze. Nora remembered those exact words. "So did I." Charles Whitaker's voice suddenly came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Charles entered, accompanied by another investor, Linda Reynolds. Emily nodded toward them. "They agreed to provide statements this morning." Charles looked directly at Brandon. "You said anonymous ownership wouldn't remain anonymous much longer." Linda added, "You also said negotiations were already finished." Brandon looked trapped for the first time. "I was speaking generally." Charles shook his head. "No?" "You were very specific." Emily thanked both witnesses before asking them to wait outside. As the door closed, Nora slowly lowered her eyes. Fragments from the previous evening began fitting together. Brandon's confidence, his mysterious phone calls, his repeated comments about ownership, his insistence that Jeffrey leave. Had any of it been coincidence? She wasn't sure anymore. Jeffrey noticed her confusion, but he said nothing. The narrator remained within Jeffrey's thoughts. He had spent years learning that truth arrived differently for everyone. Some people accepted it immediately. Others needed to watch every illusion collapse first. Margaret unlocked the second leather document case. Unlike the first, this one contained only a single thick binder. Dark blue leather, silver lettering, Lewis Family Trust. Brandon's eyes immediately fixed on it. Margaret placed the binder directly in front of Jeffrey. "The certified originals." Emily looked toward Jeffrey. "I believe it's time." Jeffrey rested one hand on the binder. He opened it slowly. Inside rested original incorporation documents dating back nearly 4 decades. Property acquisition records, trust amendments, board appointments. Every page carried embossed seals from the state of Washington. Every signature had been independently notarized. Margaret turned to the final section. "This is the current ownership certification." She slid the document toward Detective Carter. Emily read it carefully, then passed it to Brandon. He stared at the page. His face gradually lost all color. Across the top appeared Harbor Point Development Group. Below it, the certified ownership structure. Majority shareholder. Chairman of the board. Jeffrey Allen Lewis. Nora instinctively leaned towards the document. No. She whispered the word before realizing she had spoken aloud. Benjamin quietly stood. For the first time in the meeting, he addressed Jeffrey formally. Mr. Chairman? The title echoed through the conference room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nora looked at Jeffrey as though seeing a stranger. The maintenance jacket, the worn boots, the old pickup truck, the homemade lunches. Every ordinary detail she had used to define him suddenly meant something completely different. Jeffrey had never pretended to be poor. He had never claimed to be powerless. He had simply never announced who he was. Emily closed the ownership binder. She looked at Brandon one final time. Mr. Hayes. Before she could continue, a uniformed Seattle police officer knocked once on the conference room door, stepped inside, and handed her a folded document. Emily read it, then looked toward Jeffrey. The judge has signed the remaining warrants. She folded the paper carefully. Everything is now in place. No one spoke after Detective Emily Carter folded the signed warrants. The silence itself became part of the evidence. Outside the conference room windows, downtown Seattle continued its ordinary Saturday morning. Ferries crossed Elliott Bay. Traffic moved along Alaskan Way. People carried coffee cups beneath clearing skies. Inside Harbor Point's executive offices, several lives had quietly divided into before and after. Emily placed the signed warrants beside the ownership binder. Mr. Hayes, she said evenly, before we proceed any further, you should understand that this meeting is still voluntary. Brandon forced a thin smile. So I'm free to leave? Emily met his eyes. For the moment. Brandon pushed his chair back. Then I think this conversation is over. He reached for his leather briefcase. Emily did not move. Neither did the two detectives standing near the conference room doors. Brandon lifted the briefcase. It did not leave the table. One detective calmly placed a hand on it. I'm afraid that remains evidence. Brandon looked irritated. That's my property. Emily shook her head. It was seized this morning under judicial warrant. She slid a certified copy of the warrant across the table. Brandon barely glanced at it. My attorney will challenge this. I'm sure he will. Margaret Whitmore spoke for the first time in several minutes. And we'll provide him with every document he requests. There was no sarcasm, only certainty. Brandon looked around the room. Benjamin Foster, Samuel Ortiz, Margaret Whitmore, Detective Carter, Jeffrey Lewis. Nobody appeared emotional. Nobody argued. Nobody threatened him. The lack of anger unsettled him more than accusations would have. He turned toward Jeffrey. So this was your plan? Jeffrey answered quietly. No. What do you mean? My plan was to spend this morning inspecting Elevator 4. For a brief second, even Emily almost smiled. Jeffrey continued. You changed the plan. Brandon laughed once. A dry, humorless laugh. You've been pretending to fix boilers while sitting on a real estate empire. Jeffrey corrected him. I've been fixing boilers. Brandon stared at him. You expect anyone to believe that? I don't expect anything. Samuel quietly opened another folder. We have maintenance records if you'd like to verify. The room remained silent again. Nora sat motionless. Her eyes had not left Jeffrey since the ownership documents appeared. Every memory from the past 10 years now replayed differently. The old pickup truck, the repaired furniture, the simple vacations, the homemade dinners. She had interpreted them as limitations. Now she wondered whether they had always been choices. She remembered asking him once why he never bought a luxury watch. He had smiled and answered, I already know what time it is. At the time, she thought he was avoiding the question. Now she realized he simply had no interest in proving anything. Emily interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Lewis. Nora looked up. Yes. I need to ask several questions. Of course. Did your husband ever claim not to own Harbor Point Development Group? Nora hesitated. No? Did he ever tell you someone else owned it? No. Emily nodded. Did he ever lie about his occupation? Nora answered almost automatically. He always said he worked maintenance. Jeffrey quietly added, which I do. Emily looked back at Nora. So your husband never made a false statement regarding his employment? Nora lowered her eyes. No. The realization struck harder than any accusation. Jeffrey had hidden nothing. He had simply never volunteered the truth she assumed didn't exist. Emily continued. Did Mr. Hayes ever discuss acquiring Harbor Point? Yes. With whom? With investors. What exactly did he say? Nora closed her eyes for a moment. She replayed the previous night's conversations. He said ownership would become simpler. Emily wrote the sentence down. He also said negotiations were basically finished. Benjamin exchanged a glance with Margaret. Another witness. Another piece. Not dramatic. Simply factual. Emily thanked Nora before turning back to Brandon. Would you like to revise any of your earlier statements? Brandon folded his arms. No. You still deny knowing the contents of the envelope? Yes. You still deny knowing the two individuals shown in the surveillance video? Yes. Emily nodded once. Samuel reached for another remote. I think you'll find this relevant. Another video appeared on the large screen. This one was different. Not from Harbor Point. A restaurant, waterfront, 3 weeks earlier. Security footage from outside. No audio, only timestamps. Brandon sat at an outdoor table. Across from him sat one of the men from the archive burglary. The two shared dinner. They shook hands. They exchanged folders. Then another clip. A parking garage. 5 days later. Brandon speaking with the second intruder beside the same white service van. Then another. A downtown coffee shop. Both men entering together. Leaving together. Emily looked toward Brandon. You've never met them? Brandon said nothing. Emily opened a thin folder. We also recovered restaurant receipts, hotel keycard records, cell phone location data, vehicle toll records. Each one independently places you with these individuals on 9 separate occasions. Benjamin slowly exhaled. 9 meetings. Not coincidence. A relationship. Margaret carefully arranged the evidence into chronological order across the conference table. She had done this in countless lawsuits over the years. When documents were organized properly, people usually convicted themselves before trial. Jeffrey watched quietly. The narrator followed only his thoughts. His father once taught him that truth resembles a completed puzzle. No single piece matters much. But eventually there comes a moment when the picture can no longer be mistaken for anything else. That moment had arrived. Brandon suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. One detective immediately stepped forward. Sir? I'm leaving. Emily remained calm. I wouldn't advise that. You said I was free. I said you were free before we completed today's interview. Brandon pointed toward Jeffrey. This entire meeting is because of him. Jeffrey answered softly. No. It's because of choices. Brandon laughed bitterly. You think you're better than everyone because you hid behind work boots. Jeffrey looked down briefly at the worn leather boots he still wore. When he looked back up, his voice remained unchanged. No. I wore them because elevators don't repair themselves. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even Brandon seemed unsure how to answer. Benjamin quietly smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone in the room had seen all morning. Emily finally stood. She gathered the evidence folders into one organized stack. Then she looked directly at Brandon Hayes. "The interview is over." Brandon reached for his jacket. "So I can go." Emily slowly removed a folded document from the top of the stack. "This isn't another interview request." She unfolded it. "Seattle Municipal Court, State of Washington, signed only 43 minutes earlier." She read the first line aloud. "Brandon Michael Hayes, pursuant to judicial authorization, you are hereby placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit organized financial fraud, possession of falsified corporate records, unlawful access to protected business systems, and evidence tampering." The words settled over the room with astonishing calm. No shouting, no dramatic music. Only the quiet sound of one detective stepping behind Brandon while another reached for a pair of handcuffs. Brandon's confidence, so carefully constructed over months, disappeared in a single measured breath. Brandon Hayes did not resist. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at the arrest warrant, as though reading it might somehow change the words already printed across the page. Detective Emily Carter gave him the same courtesy she gave every suspect. "You have the right to remain silent." One detective stepped beside Brandon. The other waited patiently behind him. The polished conference room designed for multi-million-dollar negotiations had become something entirely different. Not a courtroom, not an interrogation room. Simply the place where months of evidence had finally reached the people responsible. Brandon slowly placed both hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs echoed softly across the room. Nobody celebrated. Jeffrey certainly did not. He remained seated exactly where he had been since the meeting began. His hands rested on the yellow legal pad in front of him. The page still contained only a few short notes. Nothing emotional, nothing personal. Just dates, times, document references. The narrator understood why. Jeffrey had spent months preparing for this moment. He had no need for dramatic speeches. Truth rarely required them. Emily continued reading the formal charges. Conspiracy to commit organized financial fraud. Possession of falsified corporate ownership records. Tampering with protected corporate documents. Knowingly receiving stolen business records. Electronic intrusion related to commercial property management. Each charge corresponded to evidence already sitting on the conference table. Not accusations, documentation. Brandon finally looked toward Jeffrey. "You planned this?" Jeffrey answered quietly. "I documented it." "You're hiding behind paperwork." Jeffrey shook his head. "No. I'm standing behind it." Emily appreciated the distinction. She had watched too many investigations collapse because victims wanted revenge more than justice. Jeffrey wanted neither. He wanted accuracy. One of the detectives carefully collected Brandon's phone. Wallet, watch, car keys. Each item entered an evidence bag. Chain of custody forms were signed immediately. Samuel Ortiz watched every step. Years earlier, Jeffrey had instructed Harbor Point's security department to document procedures as carefully as incidents. Today, that discipline mattered. Emily turned toward Brandon. "Before we leave, I have one question." Brandon remained silent. She continued anyway. "Who instructed you to alter the ownership records?" Brandon laughed once, a tired laugh. "You think this ends with me?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she waited. Silence often encouraged people to keep talking. Brandon looked around the room one last time. "You still don't understand," Benjamin frowned. "Understand what? There are investors behind this." Emily remained expressionless. "Names." Brandon smiled bitterly. "I'm done helping anyone." Jeffrey spoke for the first time in several minutes. "You've already helped." Brandon looked at him. "How?" Jeffrey nodded toward the evidence table. By being patient enough to believe you couldn't be caught. The detectives escorted Brandon toward the conference room door. Just before leaving, he stopped. He turned toward Nora. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Brandon said quietly, "I'm sorry." Nora didn't answer. She couldn't. The man she had trusted professionally for almost 2 years had been arrested less than 10 feet away from her. The door closed behind him. The conference room became strangely quiet. Only 6 people remained. Jeffrey, Nora, Margaret, Benjamin, Samuel, Emily. No one hurried to speak. Emily finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Lewis." Nora slowly looked up. "Yes. We have completed our review of your communications." Her heart sank. We obtained judicial authorization overnight." Nora swallowed. "I understand." Emily opened another folder. "You exchanged emails with Brandon." "Yes." "You scheduled meetings." "Yes." "You forwarded contractor proposals." "Yes." Nora closed her eyes briefly. "I thought they were legitimate." Emily nodded. "So did the evidence." Nora looked confused. Emily explained carefully. "Every document you forwarded came from Brandon after it had already been falsified. You didn't create them. You didn't alter them. You weren't paid. You received no financial benefit." Benjamin quietly added, "And every message shows you believed they were authentic." Emily closed the folder. "Based on everything we've reviewed," she paused deliberately, "we have no evidence that you knowingly participated in the fraud." Nora stared at her. "So, you're not a criminal suspect?" Tears immediately filled Nora's eyes, not because she had escaped prosecution, because she realized how close she had unknowingly come to disaster. Emily continued. "However," Nora looked up again, "you will almost certainly be interviewed again." "I understand." "You may also be asked to testify. If it helps establish the truth," her voice nearly disappeared, "I'll testify." Emily nodded. "Thank you." Samuel quietly turned off the conference room projector. The large screen disappeared into the ceiling. The evidence remained. The images no longer needed to be displayed. Everyone in the room had already seen enough. Benjamin slowly gathered the forged ownership certificates. He compared them beside the originals. The differences were subtle. Different dates, different trustee names, different corporate resolutions. A casual observer would never notice. But every forged page contained one fatal flaw. None of them bore Jeffrey Lewis's signature. Margaret noticed Benjamin studying the documents. "They never found it." Benjamin smiled faintly. "No. They practiced Richard Lewis's signature. They copied former directors. They forged trustees. But they never had Jeffrey's." Margaret carefully returned the original ownership binder to its protective case. "Because he never signed anything they could access." Jeffrey looked toward her. "My father insisted." She nodded. "He insisted on fountain pen signatures performed only in person." Benjamin chuckled quietly. "Old-fashioned." Jeffrey answered, "Sometimes old-fashioned survives technology." Emily zipped the final evidence box closed. "This investigation will continue." Samuel looked toward her. You think there are more people?" "I know there are." She glanced at Brandon's empty chair. "Nobody creates shell corporations' cloned credentials and forged ownership records alone." Jeffrey nodded slowly. "We'll cooperate however you need." Emily smiled. "I never doubted that." She extended her hand. Jeffrey stood and shook it. "Thank you, Detective." She answered honestly. "You made our job easier." "I only preserved records." "You preserved the truth." The detectives carried the evidence boxes toward the elevator. As the doors closed, the executive floor grew quiet once again. Benjamin finally released a long breath. I've waited 6 months for that. Samuel nodded. I've waited longer. Margaret looked toward Jeffrey. You all right? Jeffrey glanced through the conference room windows toward Harbor Point residences across downtown Seattle. Residents walked dogs along the sidewalks. Families entered the lobby carrying groceries. Children laughed near the fountain outside. Life continued, exactly as it should. I am. Margaret understood. He wasn't relieved because Brandon had been arrested. He was relieved because innocent people inside Harbor Point would no longer become victims of a crime they never knew existed. Across the room, Nora remained seated. She hadn't spoken since Emily cleared her of criminal involvement. She watched Jeffrey quietly gathering his yellow legal pad. He closed it, picked up his maintenance jacket, then reached for the same worn toolbox he had carried into the meeting that morning. No expensive briefcase, no executive escort, no dramatic exit. Benjamin looked puzzled. Where are you going? Jeffrey answered as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Elevator 4. Samuel blinked. The noise. Jeffrey nodded. It still needs fixing. Benjamin laughed softly. You're serious? Jeffrey looked at him. The residents still have to get upstairs. No one argued, because every person remaining in that room suddenly understood something the title chairman had never explained. Jeffrey Lewis had never worked maintenance to disguise who he was. He worked maintenance because to him ownership had always meant responsibility first. As Jeffrey reached the conference room door, a young administrative assistant hurried down the hallway toward him. She looked nervous. Mr. Lewis. He stopped. Yes. The lobby is asking for you. What happened? She hesitated. A group of residents just learned who owns Harbor Point. She swallowed. And they're all waiting downstairs. Jeffrey looked at the young administrative assistant for a moment before answering. Did someone invite them? She shook her head. No, sir. They heard the police were here this morning. And then one of the attorneys accidentally addressed you as Chairman Lewis in the lobby. Benjamin sighed quietly. So much for staying anonymous. Margaret closed her document case. It was only a matter of time. Jeffrey nodded once. It usually is. He picked up his maintenance toolbox. Let's go downstairs. The executive elevator descended in complete silence. Jeffrey stood beside Samuel while Margaret and Benjamin reviewed the remaining legal documents one final time. No one discussed Brandon Hayes. His arrest was no longer the company's most immediate concern. Protecting Harbor Point was. When the elevator doors opened into the main lobby, nearly 40 people stood waiting. Residents, concierges, maintenance technicians, cleaning staff, security officers, several office employees. The lobby, normally filled with quiet conversation, became completely still. Eric, the security guard who had greeted Jeffrey earlier that morning, stared in disbelief. Jeff? Jeffrey smiled. Morning again. Eric looked from Jeffrey to Margaret, then to Benjamin. Finally, his eyes settled on the Harbor Point ownership binder Margaret carried. His face slowly turned red. I've been calling you Jeff for 7 years. Jeffrey chuckled softly. You still can. A nervous laugh spread through the lobby. The tension eased almost immediately. An elderly resident named Helen Morrison stepped forward. She had lived at Harbor Point for nearly 12 years. Jeffrey had changed the battery in her smoke detector every autumn without fail. You mean, she hesitated. You own this building, Jeffrey answered honestly. Yes. Helen looked confused. Then why were you fixing my kitchen sink last month? Jeffrey smiled. Because your kitchen sink was leaking. Several people laughed quietly. The answer was so simple that no one immediately knew how to respond. Another resident raised his hand. I've seen you carrying garbage bags. I have. You cleaned snow off the front steps last winter. Yes. But, the man struggled to finish the question. Why? Jeffrey looked around the lobby. His voice remained calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. Because someone needed to. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. Samuel watched the employees more than the residents. Maintenance workers stood near the back. Most still wore work uniforms. Several looked overwhelmed. Luis Ramirez, the senior plumbing technician, finally stepped forward. I complained to you about my supervisor 3 years ago. Jeffrey nodded. I remember. I didn't know. Luis laughed awkwardly. I was complaining to the owner. You weren't. Luis frowned. Jeffrey continued. You were talking to a coworker. Luis lowered his head. Thank you. Jeffrey placed one hand gently on Luis's shoulder. You earned every promotion you've received. Luis's eyes became wet. So did everyone else. Word spread quickly through the crowd. People began remembering dozens of ordinary moments. Jeffrey carrying furniture for an elderly resident, helping a young couple change a flat tire, repairing a broken wheelchair ramp himself after contractors delayed the work, walking every floor during winter storms to check heating systems. Nothing had been staged. Nothing had been done for recognition. He simply believed ownership required presence. Benjamin quietly watched the realization move through the lobby. He had spent years preparing quarterly reports that described Jeffrey's leadership. None of those reports captured this. Leadership wasn't happening inside board meetings. It had happened every ordinary morning before sunrise. A reporter suddenly entered through the revolving doors. Then another. Samuel immediately recognized both local television stations. They're faster than I expected. Margaret looked toward Jeffrey. You don't have to speak. Jeffrey nodded. I won't. One reporter called out. Mr. Lewis. Jeffrey stopped walking. The cameras immediately focused on him. Is it true you're the anonymous owner of Harbor Point? Jeffrey answered with a single sentence. Today is about an ongoing criminal investigation. Another reporter stepped forward. Can you comment on Mr. Brandon Hayes' arrest? I'm confident the legal process will. Your wife reportedly asked you to leave before last night's investor reception. Is that true? The lobby became perfectly quiet. Every employee looked toward Jeffrey. He could have embarrassed Nora. He could have confirmed every rumor already spreading through downtown Seattle. Instead, he answered exactly as Margaret expected. My personal life isn't relevant to today's investigation. Nothing more. The reporters tried again. Did Mrs. Lewis know you owned Harbor Point? Jeffrey simply nodded politely. Have a good afternoon? He walked away. No anger, no accusation, no public humiliation. Samuel smiled faintly. You just disappointed every news station in Seattle. Jeffrey shrugged. They'll survive. Outside the lobby, television crews continued gathering. Inside Harbor Point, employees returned to work. The building still needed to operate. Residents still expected clean hallways, working elevators, reliable security. None of that changed because cameras had arrived. Jeffrey headed toward the mechanical level. Luis hurried after him. You weren't kidding. Jeffrey looked back. About what? Elevator 4. Jeffrey smiled. No. 20 minutes later, the two men stood inside the elevator machine room. The electric motor produced a low metallic vibration. Jeffrey listened carefully. He closed his eyes for several seconds. Luis waited. Finally, Jeffrey pointed toward a bearing assembly. There. Luis looked surprised. That's it. The bearing's beginning to fail. You figured that out by listening. Jeffrey nodded. It'll last another month. But replace it Monday. Luis laughed. I almost forgot. What? You're actually the best maintenance technician in the company. Jeffrey smiled. I've had good teachers. While they worked, Benjamin entered carrying a tablet. I hate interrupting. Jeffrey tightened one final bolt before climbing down. What happened? Benjamin looked serious. The investors? What about them? They've requested an emergency meeting. Jeffrey wiped grease from his hands with a shop towel. Why? They're worried Harbor Point will collapse after today's arrests. Jeffrey shook his head. It won't. I know. They don't. Benjamin handed him the tablet. They want reassurance from the owner. Jeffrey looked toward the humming elevator motor, then back at Benjamin. Schedule the meeting. This afternoon. No. Benjamin looked surprised. When? Monday morning. They won't like waiting. Jeffrey folded the shop towel neatly. They've waited years without knowing who owned Harbor Point. They can wait one more weekend. Benjamin laughed quietly. I'll let them know. As he turned to leave, his phone rang. He answered immediately. After less than a minute, his expression changed. He looked back toward Jeffrey. Nora. Jeffrey paused. What about her? Benjamin lowered the phone. She's asking if you'll meet her. Jeffrey remained silent. She said, Benjamin hesitated, there's something she should have said years ago. Jeffrey looked toward the slowly turning elevator motor. Its steady rhythm filled the room. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Jeffrey did not answer immediately. The sound of elevator 4 filled the machine room with a slow, steady rhythm. Metal turned against metal. The repaired bearing moved smoothly, reliable, predictable. Benjamin waited patiently. So, Jeffrey wiped his hands one last time before folding the shop towel over the railing. Where is she? Conference room 2. Jeffrey nodded once. I'll be there. Benjamin hesitated. You don't have to. I know. I can ask Margaret to handle anything legal. Jeffrey smiled faintly. This isn't legal. No. It's personal. Benjamin quietly left the machine room. Luis watched him disappear down the hallway before looking toward Jeffrey. You all right? Jeffrey picked up his toolbox. I will be. Luis nodded. I'll finish here. Thanks. Jeffrey walked alone through the service corridor. The route connected nearly every mechanical system inside Harbor Point. Most residents never knew it existed. Concrete walls, steel pipes, electrical conduits, nothing elegant. Yet these hidden hallways kept the entire building alive. Jeffrey preferred them. There were no appearances to maintain underground, only work. As he walked, memories surfaced without invitation. The first apartment he and Nora rented. Their Friday dinners. Long walks through Pike Place Market. The night she received her real estate license. The celebration after her first $1 million sale. None of those memories felt false. That was the difficult part. People rarely changed overnight. They drifted. One decision, then another, until eventually they no longer recognized the distance they had traveled. Jeffrey reached conference room 2 exactly on time. Nora was already there. She stood beside the window overlooking Elliott Bay. She turned as the door opened. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt familiar. Years earlier, silence between them had been comfortable. Today it carried weight. Jeffrey closed the door gently behind him. You wanted to see me? Nora nodded. Thank you for coming. He remained standing. So, she looked down at her hands. I don't even know where to begin. You don't have to begin anywhere. I do. She took a slow breath. I owe you that. Jeffrey waited. The narrator remained entirely within Jeffrey's perspective. He noticed how tired Nora looked. Not physically, emotionally. Her confidence, always carefully maintained, had disappeared. She looked more like the young graduate student he had first met in that coffee shop years ago. I've been replaying everything. She smiled sadly. Our whole marriage. Jeffrey said nothing. You never lied to me. No. I just filled in all the blanks myself. Jeffrey nodded once. Most people do. Tears gathered in Nora's eyes. I thought your old truck meant you couldn't afford another one. It runs. I thought fixing things yourself meant you were trying to save money. I don't like throwing things away. I thought homemade lunches meant... She stopped. Jeffrey finished the sentence gently. That I couldn't buy lunch. She lowered her head. Yes. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a ferry crossed Elliott Bay, leaving a long, white wake behind it. Nora looked back toward Jeffrey. Why didn't you tell me? He answered honestly. I wanted someone to know Jeffrey. Not Chairman Lewis. I married you. You did. I thought that meant titles weren't necessary. She covered her face briefly. They weren't. I made them necessary. Jeffrey didn't disagree. He also didn't agree. He simply listened. I kept waiting for you to prove people wrong. She laughed bitterly through tears. And you never tried. Jeffrey's voice remained calm. I wasn't competing with anyone. She looked directly at him. But they looked down on you. I know. Didn't that hurt? Sometimes? Then why stay quiet? Jeffrey walked toward the window. He stood beside her without looking directly at her. Do you remember Helen Morrison, our resident? The elderly woman with the broken sink? Nora nodded. You fixed it. I could have sent a plumber. You did it yourself. Jeffrey smiled slightly. Helen thanked the maintenance supervisor. He looked toward the city below. Not the owner. I preferred that. Nora finally understood. For Jeffrey, respect earned through work meant more than respect offered because of wealth. I don't think I ever understood you, Jeffrey answered softly. You understood me. You just stopped looking. That sentence hurt more than any accusation could have. Nora closed her eyes. I'm sorry. Jeffrey believed her, completely. That was what made the moment so painful. Her apology was genuine. It had simply arrived too late. I never wanted your money. I know. I wanted to be proud of my husband. Jeffrey turned toward her. You could have been. Silence. You just thought pride required something different? A tear rolled down Nora's cheek. I did. Jeffrey reached into his maintenance jacket. He removed the wedding ring he had left beside the coffee mug the previous evening. He had picked it up before leaving the apartment that morning. He looked at it for several seconds. Gold. Scratched from years of ordinary life. Camping trips, home repairs, countless days of honest work. He placed it gently on the conference table between them. Nora stared at it. I hoped, she whispered. You were bringing it back, Jeffrey answered with kindness. I brought it so neither of us would leave without clarity. She began crying quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just the kind of tears that appear when someone finally stops arguing with reality. Jeffrey waited until she regained her composure. I've asked Margaret to prepare the paperwork. Nora nodded slowly. The divorce. Yes. You already decided. I decided last night. When I asked you to leave. Jeffrey met her eyes. When you decided appearances mattered more than partnership. She didn't defend herself. There was no defense left. I don't want anything. She spoke carefully now. No property. No money. No settlement beyond what's fair. Jeffrey believed her. I know. I earned my own career. You did? And I'll rebuild it. Jeffrey nodded. I hope you do. She looked surprised. You mean that? I do. I don't hate you, Nora. She broke into tears again. I almost wish you did. It would be easier. For both of us. Jeffrey smiled sadly. Probably. Another long silence settled over the room. Finally, Nora asked the question that had haunted her since that morning. Will you ever forgive me? Jeffrey thought carefully before answering. Yes. She looked up hopefully. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. The hope in her eyes slowly faded. I understand. I don't think you do yet. He spoke gently. One day you will. Jeffrey picked up the unsigned divorce documents Margaret had left earlier. He signed his name carefully. Jeffrey Allen Lewis. The same signature Brandon Hayes had spent months trying unsuccessfully to forge. Jeffrey slid the papers across the table. Nora looked at them for several seconds, then signed beneath his name. Her hand trembled slightly. When she finished, neither reached for the documents. The marriage that had begun with shared dreams ended without shouting, without insults, without revenge. Only 2 signatures. Jeffrey gathered the papers. He paused at the door. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. I truly hope you find the life you're looking for. Then he quietly left the room. Nora remained standing beside the window, watching Elliot Bay long after Jeffrey disappeared into the hallway. For the first time in many years, she understood that the greatest thing she had lost was never Harbor Point. It was the quiet man who had never once asked the world to recognize him. Monday morning began like every other Monday at Harbor Point. Delivery trucks arrived before sunrise. The bakery across the street unloaded fresh bread for the cafe in the lobby. Cleaning crews polished the marble floors until they reflected the ceiling lights. Residents hurried toward work carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Life moved forward. That was exactly what Jeffrey wanted. At 6:30, he unlocked the maintenance workshop himself. Luis Ramirez was already inside organizing replacement parts. He looked up and smiled. Morning, Jeff? Jeffrey smiled back. Morning. Neither man mentioned the newspaper headlines. Neither mentioned Brandon Hayes. Neither mentioned the television interviews that had dominated Seattle throughout the weekend. Inside the workshop, Jeffrey remained exactly what he had always been. A co-worker. Luis handed him a clipboard. Elevator 4 passed inspection. Good. We replaced the bearing. Excellent. The vibration's gone. Jeffrey reviewed the maintenance log. Every repair had been documented, every inspection signed. He initialed the final page before returning it. Nice work. Luis grinned. I learned from the best. Jeffrey laughed quietly. We're all still learning. A few minutes later, Samuel Ortiz entered carrying a folder. The investor meeting starts in 20 minutes. Jeffrey nodded. Everything ready? Samuel smiled. For once. The conference room looked very different from Saturday. No detectives, no evidence boxes, no arrest warrants, only financial reports, occupancy statistics, capital improvement plans, maintenance forecasts. Exactly the documents investors should have been discussing from the beginning. At 8 o'clock, 12 investors entered. Among them were Charles Whitaker and Linda Reynolds, who had agreed to cooperate with investigators. Several unfamiliar faces represented pension funds and insurance companies. Some looked nervous, others simply looked curious. Jeffrey entered last, still wearing the same work boots, still carrying a yellow legal pad. Conversation stopped immediately. Benjamin stood. Ladies and gentlemen, he looked toward Jeffrey. I'd like to introduce Harbor Point Development Group's chairman, Jeffrey Lewis. Several investors stood automatically. Jeffrey raised one hand. Please. Everyone sat again. He remained standing. I appreciate all of you coming. No elaborate welcome. No polished executive speech, just a simple beginning. Charles spoke first. Mr. Lewis. Jeffrey is fine. Charles smiled. Jeffrey. He nodded. The news has created understandable concern. It has. Can Harbor Point continue operating normally? Jeffrey answered without hesitation. It already is. Benjamin projected occupancy numbers onto the screen. 98% residential occupancy. 96% commercial occupancy. No interruption to building operations. Samuel displayed security upgrades implemented over the weekend. Every cloned credential had been disabled. Additional authentication procedures were active. Independent cybersecurity consultants had completed emergency reviews. Margaret summarized the legal position. All forged ownership documents have been invalidated. Every property title remains unchanged. No resident ownership interests have been affected. Questions continued for nearly an hour. Insurance, financial reserves, vendor contracts, construction schedules. Jeffrey answered each one directly. If he didn't know a number from memory, Benjamin provided it. If legal clarification became necessary, Margaret explained it. When security questions arose, Samuel responded. Nobody interrupted one another. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody promised impossible results. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had changed completely. Charles leaned back in his chair. I've attended investment meetings for 30 years. Jeffrey looked toward him. And I've never seen an owner admit what he doesn't know. Jeffrey smiled. I employ people who know more than I do. Several investors laughed. Charles nodded appreciatively. That may be why your company survived this. After the meeting concluded, investors gradually left the conference room. Most paused to shake Jeffrey's hand. Not because he owned Harbor Point, because they trusted him. Benjamin noticed the difference immediately. Respect had replaced curiosity. Later that afternoon, Jeffrey walked through Harbor Point's residential lobby as he always had. Only now residents greeted him differently. Not with surprise, with warmth. Helen Morrison waved from her favorite chair near the fireplace. Jeffrey. He walked over. Good afternoon, Helen. I baked too many blueberry muffins. She held out a small container. I was hoping you'd help me solve that problem. Jeffrey laughed. I suppose I can. She lowered her voice. I've been thinking. About what? All these years, she smiled. I kept thanking the maintenance man. Jeffrey accepted the container. You were thanking the right person. She reached over and patted his arm. No. I was thanking the right heart. Jeffrey looked away for a moment. Compliments always made him uncomfortable. Across the lobby, several maintenance employees repaired decorative lighting near the entrance. One of the younger apprentices, Tyler Brooks, watched Jeffrey speaking with residents. Tyler had joined Harbor Point only 6 months earlier. 23 years old, recently out of technical college. He hurried over as Jeffrey walked toward the elevators. Mr. Lewis? Jeffrey turned. Yes. Tyler hesitated. I wanted to ask something. Go ahead. Why did you keep doing maintenance? Jeffrey smiled. I still do. You know what I mean. Tyler glanced around the lobby. You could have stayed in an office. I could. You could have hired people. I did. You could have let someone else handle all this. Jeffrey looked toward the front entrance. A concierge helped an elderly resident with grocery bags. A janitor quietly polished the brass door handles. 2 children laughed while waiting for the elevator. This building doesn't exist because of me. Tyler looked confused. It doesn't. Jeffrey shook his head. It exists because hundreds of people do their jobs every day. He looked back at Tyler. I just happen to be responsible for making sure they have everything they need. Tyler thought about that for several seconds. My instructor always said the owner is the boss. Jeffrey smiled gently. A boss gives orders. And an owner Jeffrey looked across the lobby once more. An owner accepts responsibility. Tyler nodded slowly. The answer seemed almost too simple, yet somehow it explained everything. That evening, Jeffrey changed into fresh work clothes before beginning his usual property walk. The route never changed. Lobby, parking garage, mechanical rooms, emergency exits, roof access, boiler controls. Exactly the same inspection he had performed hundreds of times before. Nothing about his title changed the routine. As he reached the rooftop just before sunset, Seattle spread before him in shades of gold and blue. Mount Rainier stood clearly against the horizon. The rain had finally disappeared. Samuel joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here." Jeffrey accepted one. "Thanks." Samuel looked out across the skyline. "You know?" "What?" "You could finally move into the executive office." Jeffrey laughed softly. "The maintenance workshop has better coffee." Samuel smiled. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that." They stood quietly for several minutes. Below them, Harbor Point continued operating exactly as it should. Residents came home. Lights turned on one floor after another. Elevators moved steadily between levels. No one worried about forged documents. No one thought about criminal conspiracies. They simply lived their lives. Jeffrey considered that the greatest success Harbor Point could ever achieve. Not headlines, not awards, normalcy. As the last sunlight disappeared behind the Olympic Mountains, Jeffrey finished his coffee. He looked once more over the city before heading back toward the stairwell. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day, and that to him was worth more than any title. Tuesday arrived without television trucks outside Harbor Point. The reporters had moved on. The headlines had changed. Seattle was already chasing another story. Jeffrey preferred it that way. Long before sunrise, he unlocked the maintenance workshop with the same worn brass key he had carried for years. The familiar smell of machine oil and fresh coffee greeted him. Luis Ramirez was replacing filters for the building's water system. Tyler Brooks was organizing electrical supplies. Eric, the security guard, stopped by carrying a box of donuts. "Peace offering," he joked. Jeffrey smiled. "For what?" "For spending 7 years calling my boss Jeff." Jeffrey laughed. "You were calling your coworker Jeff." The room filled with quiet laughter. Nothing felt forced. No one treated Jeffrey like a celebrity. That mattered more to him than any newspaper article. By mid-morning, Harbor Point felt exactly as it always had. Residents greeted one another in the lobby. Children waited for the school shuttle. The concierge answered questions about package deliveries. Maintenance requests appeared on the workboard. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Benjamin Foster entered the workshop carrying a thin folder. "I thought you'd want to see this." Jeffrey wiped his hands before opening it. Inside was a preliminary report from Seattle Police Financial Crimes. Several additional search warrants had been executed overnight. Electronic devices recovered from Brandon Hayes' office had led investigators to 2 more shell companies and 3 additional suspects. Benjamin looked relieved. "They're finding everyone." Jeffrey nodded. "They will." Emily Carter had been right. Brandon had never acted alone. But the system was working exactly as it should. Evidence led investigators to facts. Facts led to warrants. Warrants led to arrests. Not assumptions, not rumors. Documentation. Jeffrey closed the folder. "Keep cooperating." "We will." Benjamin hesitated. "You really aren't interested in following the investigation every hour, are you?" Jeffrey smiled. "I trust the detectives." Benjamin laughed quietly. "I should have known." Before leaving, he paused. "By the way, the board unanimously approved your proposal." Jeffrey looked up. "Which one?" "The Employee Improvement Plan." Jeffrey nodded. "Good." Benjamin grinned. "I thought you'd be more excited." Jeffrey looked around to the maintenance workshop. Luis was explaining a plumbing diagram to Tyler. Eric was pouring coffee into paper cups for everyone. The exciting part isn't approving it. Benjamin followed Jeffrey's gaze. It's seeing it work. That afternoon, Harbor Point Development Group announced a series of permanent changes. Every hourly maintenance employee received a salary increase. Emergency training programs were expanded. Scholarship funds were created for employees' children. An anonymous hardship fund was replaced with a transparent employee assistance program. Vendor oversight procedures became some of the strictest in Washington state. Every contractor would now pass independent verification before entering the property. The changes were practical, not symbolic. Exactly the kind of reforms Jeffrey believed mattered. Late in the afternoon, Tyler knocked gently on the open workshop door. "You've got a visitor." Jeffrey looked up. "Who?" Tyler stepped aside. Nora stood quietly in the hallway, not wearing designer clothes, not carrying an expensive handbag, just jeans, a navy sweater, and a simple folder in her hands. Jeffrey walked over. "Hello?" "Hi." Neither seemed uncomfortable, only different. "I won't keep you long." "It's all right." She handed him the folder. "My attorney finalized everything." Jeffrey accepted it. "Thank you. I also wanted to tell you something." He waited. "I resigned yesterday. From Emerald Pacific Realty." Jeffrey nodded once. "I heard. I need to start over." She smiled sadly. "I think that's probably good for me." Jeffrey believed she meant it. "I hope you find somewhere that appreciates your abilities." She looked at him for a long moment. "You always did." Jeffrey didn't answer, because it was true. "I won't ask for another chance." She continued quietly. "I lost that." He remained silent. "I only wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For never trying to destroy me." Jeffrey looked toward the busy maintenance workshop. "I wasn't trying to win." Nora smiled through damp eyes. "I know." She extended her hand, not as a wife, not even as someone hoping for reconciliation, simply as one person acknowledging another. Jeffrey shook it. "I wish you well, Nora." "You too, Jeffrey." She walked away without looking back. Jeffrey watched until the elevator doors closed. Then he returned to work. The chapter had ended exactly as it should. Without bitterness, without spectacle. Several weeks passed. Summer settled over Seattle. Flowers bloomed around Harbor Point's entrance. Residents gathered on the rooftop garden during warm evenings. The criminal investigation continued quietly through the courts. One by one, additional participants accepted plea agreements. Financial losses were recovered. Insurance companies completed reimbursements. The building itself never missed a single mortgage payment payroll cycle or resident service. Most people eventually stopped talking about the scandal. Instead, they talked about something else. The owner who still carried a toolbox. Visitors often entered Harbor Point expecting to meet a wealthy executive in an expensive office. Instead, they sometimes found Jeffrey adjusting a door closer, helping a resident carry groceries, or inspecting the cooling towers before sunrise. At first, they seemed surprised. Eventually, they understood. One evening, just after 9 o'clock, Jeffrey completed his final property walk. The lobby was quiet. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The concierge finished logging the day's package deliveries. Eric prepared for the night shift. Jeffrey walked slowly toward the front entrance. He checked the emergency exit indicators, tested the automatic doors, verified the security panel. The same routine, every night. Before stepping outside, he looked back across the lobby. Everything worked. The elevators moved smoothly. Residents laughed near the fireplace. A young family crossed the marble floor toward the parking garage. No one noticed the owner standing near the entrance. Jeffrey preferred it that way. He reached for the heavy brass handle and locked the outer inspection access exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. Not because someone else couldn't, because responsibility was never something he delegated completely. He stepped onto the sidewalk. Seattle's skyline shimmered across Elliott Bay. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of ferry horns. Jeffrey slipped his hands into the pockets of his maintenance jacket and began walking toward his old Ford F-150. The truck still had faded paint. The boots on his feet still carried small scratches from years of honest work. Nothing about his life looked dramatically different, yet everything that truly mattered had become clearer. People had mistaken humility for weakness. They had confused quietness with insignificance. They believed appearances revealed value. They were wrong. Jeffrey never needed to prove who he was. Time did that. Evidence did that. Character did that. And in the end, the police did not escort him back because he was powerful. They escorted him back because the law had confirmed what had always been true. Harbor Point belonged to Jeffrey Lewis. But more importantly, Jeffrey Lewis had always belonged to Harbor Point. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who never feel the need to announce their strength. Jeffrey never won because he shouted louder, sought revenge, or tried to embarrass those who underestimated him. He won because he remained patient when others became careless, because he valued facts over emotions, and because he trusted that truth supported by evidence can outlast even the most convincing lie. In everyday life, it's easy to judge people by their job title, clothes, car, or the way they choose to live. But character is built in the ordinary moments that no one applauds: keeping promises, treating people with respect, doing honest work, and taking responsibility even when no one is watching. Those quiet habits often reveal far more about a person than success ever can. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance, your job, or the way you chose to live? Or have you ever realized too late that someone deserved far more respect than you gave them? Share your story in the comments. Your experience may encourage someone else who's going through the same thing today. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is about another ordinary man whose quiet decisions changed far more lives than anyone around him ever imagined.